What do I think is going to happen? Let me pontificate about the future for a moment. Obviously can't predict it, but there do seem to be some trends that we can see. Now, I say 2024 to 2030. That's a bit of an exaggeration. Who on earth knows what's going to happen by 2030? 6 years is such a long time, or 5.5 years, such a long time. And also, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with this technology. But allow me to just take a guess. What I would say, here's my guess that's going to be embarrassing in a couple of years if I'm totally wrong. But my guess is that AI is plateauing for the moment. So I guess you could call me in the Jan LeCun camp in terms of where I think this is going. I'm not in AGI in 2026 or 2027. That's not the camp that I'm in, just in terms of what we see in terms of technology. Instead, what we're seeing is the OpenAIs of the world. They seem to be investing in performance enhancements and in improving the productivity of their code. So you see, for instance, 4.0 with their latest model to 4.0 mini. Now, don't you think that if OpenAI had 5 ready, that they would much more happily release that instead of 4.0 mini? Instead, they released a 90% drop in costs as they optimized their code, optimized their infrastructure so that they can deliver more for less, which is a good thing for the economy as a whole. It's a good thing for them as a company and for growth in the industry. But it's very different than saying that the robots are coming for all of us, in a couple of years. So if this is true, then what we see is something like a large productivity gain. And I'm talking about software development specifically, but really it's going to impact a much broader set of knowledge work type jobs. But we see this boost in productivity. And as I mentioned before, that is going to lead to a drop in demand. But how does that drop in demand, for the sort of marginal software developer hour, how does that really impact? And so if we think of it as different types of roles in the software world, this is what I would say. I would say that if we look at specialists versus generalists, then specialists are going to win versus generalists in the sense that if you know deep details of, performance optimization or of the particularities of a certain tech stack at scale, so whether that's building, at least for the present, a React Native, enterprise-grade application, not even enterprise-grade application, but just a mobile application that is truly deep but still performant in React Native. I don't know, just to throw out a random example. Or rather, to build a, scalable asynchronous architecture. Things that the bots can't easily pump out. And doing performance tuning at the edges. I keep going back to that use case, but there's a lot of other ones in that vein. Maybe it's, observability. Maybe it's certain security concerns. Of course, the bots are going to improve productivity across the board, but relative to some of those specialized tech use cases, and there are so many, the generalist that is just cranking out the standard kind of, CRUD application, which is sort of the pejorative that people use, and these days you can build a lot of those just in low code, but who's building that basic application, well, that's the kind of thing that you can crank out increasingly with AI super fast. And so there gets to be less emphasis here and more on having particular skills. And I would say, even more than that, it's vertical knowledge. Vertical knowledge crossed with tech knowledge, that is actually super high value. So specialists with vertical knowledge and maybe certain niche technology knowledge, that becomes higher value. Unfortunately, we have a circumstance in which not just generalists, but also juniors or new folks entering the field, they are going to struggle more. So we're going to see a lot more struggle on this side, because what we're seeing is that the folks who are senior engineers or architect level, they are able to wield the bots as their juniors. And increasingly, as technology matures, even more so. So there will get to be an interesting bifurcation where there's a gap. If I had to speculate on what kind of structure that kind of industry or that kind of job market takes, starts to look a little bit more like medicine. If I just like guess for a moment, in medicine, what you see actually these days, the majority of physicians end up being specialists. You have relatively few. I mean, of course, you have family practice doctors, but you have relatively fewer on a percentage basis, generalists and specialists. And you also have folks training for a very long time at really quite low pay as residents and such as they are picking up their skills before going into private practice or into sort of, their final working kind of status. And there's sort of a phase shift where they finally make it out, and then they're all of a sudden, earning a very high income and producing in that way. We could start to see some of that in the tech world where folks have to train. When I say train, I don't mean train in the sense of like, it's not going to be residencies for developers. That's not what I mean. But they have to train in terms of probably working at relatively lower comp than we've seen. So gone are the days of getting hired out of school for 200 grand. I mean, that was some of the pandemic overhiring nonsense that was going on. Maybe even more than that in some crazy cases. There was just nonsense was going on. So now we're chopping back. And it wouldn't surprise me if it is the case again that one enters the field back in the 5 figures and has to build your way back up to the premium compensation that we've earned. And that will still be possible, but for a much smaller number of specialists, as opposed to every rando who had a computer science degree who kind of sort of knew what they were talking about in 2020. So the world is changing, but I still think that vertical knowledge is going to be important, particularly when it's married to strong tech skills. And I think that AI, as we've seen it, it does appear to be plateauing in its capabilities in this regard. So it is probably not the case that there will be, 90% less developers in a year. I do think it wouldn't surprise me at all if relative to population growth, if we basically see a flat line in the total number of developers in the United States, maybe even a slight decline. But remember, even a flat line means that as the population grows, that means that there's net less employment in the software industry than there used to be. And that's, some amount of back to normal, some amount of a supply shock. And then we end up at the new normal of tomorrow.